Chicago. Oh my goodness.
Montreal in the house.
I know,
Hey.
so many great people. All right, so I'm going to get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Taylor. I am your moderator and host for today. I'm also the founder of Strive With Me, which is a platform making personal development and social change more accessible. So we're here today to talk about anti-racism in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. Specifically, we're going to focus on the barriers that our community faces when it comes to speaking out about these topics, tools to help communicate within your community, and how to hold space for meaningful dialogue. We respectfully call you in on this matter, sharing all of this information with love, and understand that we are only scratching the surface here. We hope that you will take what you learned here and continue to be curious, be kind, and work through these difficult and uncomfortable topics that this may bring. So for some of us, this may be an issue we're aware of, maybe even worked on for years, like our wonderful panelists, while for others, it may be the first time we're having this conversation at this depth. So for those in the latter category, I say welcome, thank you for joining us, and being willing to do the hard work, because we understand that a lot of these issues predates you, but hopefully it will end with you. So I want to give a quick shout out to everyone that donated. We've already raised over $500 for Reclaim the Block, Black Lives Matter, and Black Girls Code. So thank you so much for that. If anyone's still interested, I'm actually going to include the event page link right now, so that if anyone wants to donate, you can go on to our event page, and it will be, just go through it as if you are buying a new ticket, and we'll be able to donate that after the event. Before we get started with our panelists, which I'm very excited for you to meet them, we're just going to go over some quick community guidelines. I only have 3. First one is we're going to do our best to get to as many questions as we can with a time limit. Everyone here submitted so many great questions, so was able to kind of highlight a lot of the common questions for our wonderful panel. So please forgive us if we don't get to your questions. We'll try to do our best to answer them after the event. Because this is a highly charged conversation, we ask that you be kind and gentle with one another as well as yourself during this event. If for any reason any of this is too triggering for you, please feel free to if you need to leave, please, that's totally fine. You could always revisit this at a later time on the YouTube channel. We prioritize your mental well-being, so we hope you do too. And last one, please be mindful of the safety of others in this event. We are more than willing to remove people if they decide to escalate this in a non-compassionate manner. So with that, I welcome you to this conversation on anti-racism in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And welcome to our panelists. Please, panelists, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Do you want anybody to go first?
Oh, well, you're unmuted first, so you volunteer.
Oh, sure. Hi, everybody. Oh, do you want to start admitting people?
Yep,
Melissa?
I got it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'll keep it short and quick. My name is Jess Song. I'm the founder of Back to Self, which focuses on emotional navigation and emotional communication and journaling, particularly through a multicultural lens. I'm really excited to be here.
I'll go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Vannery Kong. I am the United States Global Trade Sherpa for the Youth G20 Summits, and I am the co-founder of The World, which is a global coalition to bring awareness to equality in the U.S.
All right, Shane, Wei.
So my name is Due Qua, Vietnamese, so it's pronounced Due and spelled D-U-E. I'm the founder and author of Calm Clarity, the book there. We help people face trauma, heal trauma, and tackle unconscious bias, systemic racism, do a lot of training in companies. And I'm also the founder, co-founder of the Collective Success Network, which is a nonprofit dedicated to helping first-generation low-income students to successfully navigate college and enter professional careers. Many of our students are Black, Brown, Asian, and they face a lot of obstacles, financial barriers to graduating college. And this discussion is very relevant to the work that I do towards socioeconomic and racial inclusion. So I'm excited to be here.
And hi, everyone. My name is Shane Nelson. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the co-founder and managing partner for Reify Solutions, LLC. So we help nonprofit organizations grow in different ways. And the reason why I'm so excited to be on this panel is a lot of my early work with social justice within organizations has now kind of grown for a new webinar series that we offer to people during this time where there's a lot of confusion and misinformation. So I'm really excited to provide my perspective as a social justice practitioner, but also providing a Black and Indian perspective in here. So I'm really excited again to be with you all tonight.
Awesome. Well, we're going to get started right away to obviously this is a very interesting time in the world. It's a time of great change. But with that, there are a lot of barriers, especially within our communities. So I would like to address this to the panel, starting with Zway. Like, what do you think from your work and experience, what are the barriers to speaking up about anti-racism?
Sure. So the panel has actually brainstormed a couple days ago on the common barriers that we've seen. So I've just sent out a link to Google Slides. See this document for yourself. And I think to make sure we're on the same page in terms of terminology, I think would be a good idea to explain what anti-racism is, so we know what we're talking about. So the definition is that it means it's the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organization structures, policies, and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So we're talking about changing from a white supremacy model, white power structure, to one where every non-dominant group, every racial group shares an equal portion of power, right? And so when we talk about the barriers to the Asian American community, we came up with a list of 6. And I think one of it, just to start with, because many of us were immigrants, or our parents were immigrants, grandparents were immigrants, and they came over here to realize the American dream. That is the sole focus, right? Do well, climb up the ladder, be academically successful, and then have the American dream. We don't think about the history of the civil rights movement and our place in it. We just think, it's not to say that we're self-centered, it's just that we don't know the context, and that's why we came here and we focus on it. And then we learn about racism. Then the question is, do I mind my own business? What's in it for me? Does this affect me? And until I think Asian Americans become more educated that in the United States, all these non-dominant groups only gained rights by fighting for their rights through protesting, through legislative reform, through lawsuits and legal battles. And many Asian Americans did participate in that process historically. But until all Asian Americans are aware that this is actually required for everyone to advance, we usually don't speak up, and we're not that civically engaged. So that's my thought on 2 of the barriers. Does anyone want to chime in on those 2 barriers?
I think, oh, go ahead, Jess, please.
No. I saw Vannery unmuted before me, so I'm gonna.
All right, perfect. We're gonna toss it to Vannery then.
Okay, so in regards to the barriers, I'm just going to speak from my own personal experience going into global governance, dealing with other countries at the policy level. Even though international organizations like the United Nations and the International Courts of Justice have condemned discrimination of any kind, I feel like it's kind of hard to address it because no one wants to reframe on finger pointing and everyone wants to remain diplomatic in some senses. And I also feel like in regards to that, there's not like they want to prevent a way of putting ahead of the other. So those are my thoughts in regards to that.
Your panel's so polite. Shane, you want to go first?
I think another aspect of this, and we'll touch a little bit on it later as we talk to the kind of 6th barrier, but like a little bit of foreshadowing is really within anti-racist work and really looking at it globally. Anti-Blackness is a global concept and it manifests in so many different ways, right? We see it in colorism, we see it in just the larger capitalist structure that we work in. And it's tricky stuff. And it's something where it takes a lot to really reflect on first and to see where you fit in. And I want to point everyone's attention to Mamta Akapadi's point of entry model with like regards to specifically an Asian American identity consciousness. There are so many different influences that come in with within this model, right? So you have any sort of ethnic attachment, any sort of familial influence, immigration history, whatever external influences and perceptions you're getting from the media. And then also this idea of like a larger concept of self. So we're dealing with a lot, right? But once we start reflecting and having these really conscious conversations, we can create a lot of change.
Thank you. And I think just to piggyback off of what all the panelists have said so far, or rather I agree with everything that the panelists have said so far. And I think for me, just considering my line of work, I found that a lot of the barriers to being able to have conversations around race within the Asian community has been a lot about things that get triggered within ourselves and things that get triggered within other people, particularly around, and it could be anything from like big traumas that either community has faced or just personal triggers that we carry that cause us to become defensive or violent and makes the conversation very unproductive. So that's where I'll be speaking on a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because for a lot of people here, regardless of where you are on the advocacy and activism spectrum, there's a lot of us that want to have this. I don't think the 145 people that joined this event wouldn't join and take the time out of their Wednesday if they weren't interested. But that being said, we do have to recognize that it comes way before us, and then there's a lot of contributing factors, but we are going to talk about ways that we can deal with that a little bit later on. So Shane and Vannery, really want to chat with you both based on your work on how to have these conversations, we need to have inclusive spaces. So how can we create those safe, inclusive spaces for anyone that is open and willing? And I think that's really important, is that they have to be open and willing to have a discussion and open that up emotionally, because it is taxing.
Yeah, I think in the work that I've done kind of across higher ed and with organizations, the biggest piece first is trying to ensure psychological comfort and safety. If I come up to you randomly and I say, hey, you want to take a risk? You're like, I don't know you. I don't have anything.
What are you selling me, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when we think about getting people primed and ready for conversations related to any sort of anti-racist work, any sort of social justice work, we're really asking them to take a risk out of their current behaviors and any sort of implicit bias, right? Growth takes risk. So ensuring that psychological safety in terms of having like really nice structured guidelines, ensuring that everybody's using the same terminology and tools is also super important. In a recent book chapter that my partner and I worked on, we lay out the landscape of what language is being used right now in social justice, because a lot from what I've been seeing in different spaces, people use them like trading cards, and that's not helpful and that's not conducive to the conversation, right? So if someone plays, feminism and then another person plays intersectional feminism, did that person win the argument? No, right? We have to play with the same terms, and that's another element of like psychological safety and really helping people get ready to have these conversations.
And I just want to almost break that down a little bit, because I've had these conversations and highlight what Shane said, is that when you're speaking about these things, and a lot of these words right now are racially charged and have a lot of different interpretation, right? Which is why I'm really grateful that Zwei defined what anti-racism is and what that means. And so for us, when you have these conversations, what does these certain terminology means? Like, what does defunding the police look like? What does standing up and protesting, whatever that looks like, and really start to break down, like, hey, like, make sure you don't center yourself. Well, wait, what does centering yourself means? Because we've had this conversation before where in like spiritual practices, centering yourself is a good thing. It means you're grounded and things like that. But when it comes to the topic of race and social justice, centering stuff is like, well, look at me, look, what about my experience? And that doesn't, like, kind of setting that foundation to understand what it is that we're talking, so we're not talking over each other, we're not miscommunicating. So Vannery?
Yes, thank you, Melissa. I wanted to start off with a quote that one of my mentors actually told me a long time, not a long time, it was a couple months ago. So Ambassador Gina Winstanley, she was the U.S. Ambassador to Malta. She always told me that change doesn't happen with one person, it happens in waves. So with my role being in cybersecurity and in the global governance role, one of the biggest issues is the digital divide and artificial intelligence with implicit bias. Yeah, sorry, I just saw what Jess just put. So in regards to the digital divide, there's a lot of young people that want to have these opportunities to be in these safe spaces, whether it's Y20, Model United Nations, or even just having their voice in the United Nations. So for me personally, what I try to do and just try to do with like a lot of my colleagues is how do we reach out to people in spaces where if they're not in like a Washington, D.C., if they're in the Midwest or if they're in a third world country, how do we make sure their voice is being heard at the policy level decision? When lawmakers are making these big decisions, who is the population that's most vulnerable? It's always going to be people of color, people who lack resources. So you want to really make sure that everyone who's affected by one decision always has a seat at the table, or like what Ms. Shirley Chisholm always said, if there's not room at the table, bring a folding chair. So that's what I always try to do to advocate, whether on the policy level, just making sure, even if it's something as far as having a survey. I know personally when we went to Japan last year, when Japan held the G20 summit chair, I held a survey and I put one out saying, what do you know about intellectual property protection? How do you know that protects you from the global markets all the way down to the small to medium-sized enterprises? You really want to make sure that when you give people a voice, that they're also being educated and being prompted with these questions so they know what to prepare for when they are answering these questions.
Yeah. And I think that it's interesting because both with Vannery and Shane's work, it deals with this on a much bigger scale. And with Jess and Sway's work, it's more on the ground level. It's dealing with a lot of personal relationships and things like that. Can you both speak a little bit about that and how you can create that space so that whether it's with your family, whether that's with your friends, to be able to, one, be calm and cool about it and talk about this in an open and compassionate manner, but being able to call them, instead of calling them out for something like, hey, what you said was really messed up, saying like, hey, like, I just want to call you in. I think may have been what you meant. I don't think that came off as clear as you had intended.
Yeah, I'll definitely elaborate on it more. I think the other thing that's starting to more common now that we live in a globalized society is that people from different backgrounds are starting to come into environments where we weren't typically allowed to come into during the segregation time. So when someone says something to me, and whether it's an insensitive comment, I typically tend to break the barriers by making a joke out of it. So normally with my name personally, everyone always thinks that I'm Chinese until they see me. So everyone always asks me like, it's like they're asking if I'm Asian, but they don't say those words. So I always have to make a joke saying, oh, my dad's Black, Cambodian. I'm Cambodian and Black. And then I have to kind of explain, and then give them like a mini history. And then we just kind of leave it there. I said, but my parents loved each other very much. It wasn't really about race. But just for me, I always try to find a common ground, normally through humor, because that's where everyone's comfort level typically tends to be.
I really want to piggyback off that as well. I think coming from like a Black and Asian space, like intergroup dialogue was just like home conversation. I see intergroup dialogue as like another thing for people, like in terms of engaging with different groups that you haven't engaged with before. And so using humor and using like other tools to influence people is super key in terms of bringing them into new knowledge spaces. I think another element too, I love the piece of calling in, because I think the tool that I use in kind of educational context, so I work at a community college as well. And so with a lot of my students, I call them into growth, right? Because that's what we're trying to like motivate somebody into. And so some of the elements of calling into growth really focus on like understanding someone else's language and frames first, before even bringing in any sort of like theoretical construct, any sort of article, any sort of title, any sort of tool, because that common ground is so essential and so important. And I think when you try to frame the dialogue with talking to family members, you really want to center your own narrative in a way that is called counter narratives, right? Or counter storytelling. And so stories are another way to bring people into dialogues and into conversation in a way where they just get to observe. So back in 2016, I was able to have a longer extended dialogue with my mom about, you know, race in America with the change in the presidency. And so seeing all of the, you know, anti-Muslim rhetoric, the Islamophobic rhetoric, and oftentimes both my mother, myself, my brother, and my sister, we also get lumped up into a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric, even though we grew up in a Hindu household. And so it took the stories, and it took, you know, me showing my mom like, hey, I was fearful for myself. I shaved my beard at one point. And really opening up with that element. So vulnerability is another element too. So if you use humor, you want to use vulnerability, I think the common thread in that too, in terms of bringing people into dialogues for growth, is storytelling too.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's really helpful to, I think for us, speaking peer-to-peer, and we have the conversational tool, the emotional language, which we're going to get into in a little bit. We can speak about that, and we understand the guidelines, we can read the resources, but it's not always the case. I think right now, especially, like, I know myself, I'm struggling to speak with my family about this and trying to get them to understand and kind of uproot that racism that is so ingrained in our culture, right? And I think that's a big barrier, is that whether you grew up in a different country, that culture's history and that intergenerational trauma, as well as here in American history, there is a strong sense of anti-Blackness. And I can speak for myself, coming from a Vietnamese background, where I had to say, like, hey, no, like, you don't mess with other people, Black, white, brown, anything, like, they're not gonna mess with you. So don't go crazy and flaunting like diamonds, and you won't get robbed, Mom, you'll be fine. It's not really them, it's more so for you. So I know Jess kind of specializes in this area of having the tools to be able to have the tools for emotional language. So can you share with the group, what are some ways to be able to have the dialogue to address it?
Sure. Thanks so much. And I kind of want to preface this by saying that my workshops around this are usually on their own an hour and a half long. So I'm going to try to fit what I can into the next like 10 minutes or so. But, both Valerie and Shane and, and Zoe have all kind of mentioned the importance of communicating and asking, just kind of seeing where they're coming from as well. And, one thing I wanted to mention, somebody in a response to your question, Melissa, about like, how do you create safe spaces for other people? I think what's been really interesting, I just want to add a note and then I'll kind of jump into mine, is that sometimes we assume that we know what somebody would consider a safe space, and sometimes we have to outright ask them what they consider a psychological safe space, or what they consider supportive, so that you're both on the same page. Because sometimes I might be thinking I'm being supportive when actually it's like the opposite of what they think of support. So I just kind of wanted to piggyback that too. And while I go into this, I just want to, ask the participants here to just casually, I don't want to trigger anybody here, but just to casually just enter in challenges that you might have had trying to communicate with folks around anti-Blackness and around race, right? I think especially if you're trying to talk to people in your own community or your family, right? What communication challenges have you experienced? And then if I'm able to, I'll kind of try to tie in specific ones into my part. But I'm just gonna dive in real quick. But so I think there's a few routes that conversations can take that lead to unproductive conversations, right? And I think we kind of experience a lot of them. The person that you're talking to gets defensive. The person that you're talking to might get triggered in a particular way. This is an important one that I think a lot of us forget. The person's identity ends up getting challenged, right? Whether they believe themselves to be good people, whether they believe themselves to be, social justice oriented. And if you try to call them out on something that they might be doing, that might challenge it and then lead to a shutdown in conversation. the person that you're talking to might feel judged by the conversation that you're having, or the person has a belief that really can't be swayed by facts or anybody else's experiences, right? I would say all of those except the last thing can be very intentionally and carefully approached by us to try to help reduce that using nonviolent communication strategies. As far as the last one, about where like, the person has a belief that can't be swayed no matter what. I read a really fun Twitter, used very lightly here, Twitter thread by an author, Ijoma Oluo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but she wrote this book called So You Want to Talk About Race. And she made an interesting parallel that, there's that one racist uncle who's like a hardcore Trump supporter maybe. And you try to reason with them. And she said, listen, some people refuse to accept facts or opinions or experiences that just don't align with what they believe, and they'll dismiss it. So sometimes it's like having to have an argument with like a flat earther, just like don't do it, right? But if it comes down to things about like people getting defensive, triggered, challenged, that leads to unproductive conversations, a lot of that could be managed differently. So the 3 parts I'll talk about in the short time that I have are going to be this. They're going to all be around this. One is to really know your emotions and yourself first as you enter a conversation. 2 is to use the foundations of nonviolent communication, which I'll go briefly into here. And 3, to find opportunities for the person that you're talking to relate and understand to what's actually happening. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So when I talk about knowing your own self, there's a few questions that I usually ask my friends and clients when I'm working through this. I've been talking to a lot of people one-on-one around their challenges with this conversation. So one thing that I usually ask is, what are your actual emotions around this conversation, right? Every time I ask somebody what they feel, they almost immediately tend to avoid using actual emotion words, and they start going into like the philosophies or their opinions about stuff, right? The injustice, their goals, their objectives, and how they're not being met. But when I'm like, okay, but what do you feel? They have to like really sit down and be like, well, but start out with the bigger words, right? And I kind of call these fuzzy words. Do you feel sad? Do you feel angry? Are you stressed, right? A lot of those words actually mean something else, right? Even more than sad, are you disappointed? Are you confused that your friends would dismiss your values? Are you, even deeper than that, are you feeling scared that you're going to lose another friend? Are you feeling guilty that you didn't know about all of this injustice sooner? And this, I think, is a really big one that has been an underlying factor in a lot of the very aggressive activism that's been happening. Are you feeling shame around anything? Are you feeling shame that you maybe weren't doing this right? Or are you feel shame that you might have been racist without thinking about it? Or are you feeling shame that you haven't, insert anything here, right? And I think we all have to be very honest here. For many of us, shame is a huge part of why we feel motivated to act right now. And that I saw somebody on an Instagram, one of these beautiful Instagram meme things, but the thing about activism based on shame is that it's very unsustainable, and it often leads to burnout and lots of frustration and feelings of inadequacy. And my personal theory is that when you make decisions based on fear, guilt, or shame, you feed into a cycle of fear, guilt, or shame. It never actually finishes, right? So, and the thing is that outside of therapy, we rarely learn to hold stillness in fear, guilt, and shame. We just immediately try to act out of it. Right? It's just such an uncomfortable feeling that we either yell at somebody or we do this or we do that. And we don't realize that fear, guilt, and shame are highly informative spaces that if we sit still in it, it'll actually help direct the conversation that we want to have. So I really want to encourage you to sit and think about what feelings you have. And when you bring your emotions into conversations, it actually allows for a much more vulnerable conversation and much more like personal conversation rather than just yelling at people for not doing things right. So that's the very first thing. What's your emotions around this conversation? The second thing that I want to bring in about knowing yourself is what is your actual objective, right? Have a very clear idea of what you want their takeaway to be. So let's say if your main takeaway, if that you want them to walk away is that they're wrong and they need to know that they're wrong, you signed yourself up for an unproductive conversation, and that conversation isn't going to go anywhere, right? And actually, Shane wrapped this up earlier, like beautifully earlier, right before this call. He was like, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? And a lot of the times we walk into these conversations really needing to believe that we're right and needing them to see that we're right. I'm going to let you know right now, you're going to stress yourself out, and maybe you want to try a different approach, right? So here are some things, right? And I think what happens a lot is when we walk into a conversation not really having a clear idea of our objective, we talk about everything. And the thing about race, that's something so pervasive as anti-Blackness, it's hard to have a conversation without bringing in the world, right? So that conversation is going to go everywhere. So do you want them to relate emotionally to the Black Lives Matter movement? Maybe you want to really stick with that. Do you want them to explore their own anti-Blackness in a way that's personal to them? Then maybe you should just stick with that, right? Do you want them to see how important this is for you and your friendship, right? Then you want to stay with that, right? Try to stick to that because, I would say use that as an anchor when the conversation starts to feel out of control, because then you can also know, you know what, I'm going to leave this alone here and I'll come back another time. Once you start bringing all this other stuff, you lose them, they lose you, and then that's it. Okay. So far to recap is know your emotion, know your actual objective. 3, identify your personal triggers. I heard this in another training on de-escalation, but I want to kind of rephrase it well, is that how do you expect to de-escalate someone else if you can't de-escalate yourself, right? So once you start feeling triggered, I'm going to start yelling, and then they're feeling triggered and we're just yelling, and then all of a sudden we're just escalating, and that's it, the conversation is over, right? So I do a lot of workshops around personal triggers, but there's a few things here. Like, so do you feel triggered when someone suggests you're incompetent? Do you feel triggered when someone dismisses you, when they interrupt you, when someone laughs at you, makes you feel small? Do you feel triggered when your perfectionism, like when things about your perfectionism gets pushed against, your fear of being wrong, right? Everybody has a very personal trigger that's going to come up in difficult conversations. Recognize when it's happening and then stay grounded so you know how to restructure. And in my work, I've come to realize that there's 3 main things I think that people are most uncomfortable with, and it's really painful to deal with. One is when a trigger confronts their sense of identity, right? This is going to come up a lot when you talk to people about racism. Am I a good person? Or, am I say, things like that. And I think when we're forced to confront something that challenges our sense of identity, we actually can't do it. It's too big. 2, when something confronts their sense of control, okay? So if they feel like they're starting to lose control of the conversation, or if admitting to anti-Blackness might make them feel like a loss of control in something else, that conversation might go awry. And 3, when it confronts their sense of belonging or safety, okay? And I think it's not only difficult to deal with in ourselves, but in other people, right? So some of this stuff is gonna get triggered in conversations with other people. Like if you try to talk to somebody about somebody in the actual police department, all 3 of these things might end up getting triggered, right? My sense of identity as a police officer, my sense of control as a police officer, my sense of belonging or safety in the police department. It's going to be really hard for people to navigate around that painful trigger. And I also want to say, triggers and trauma, I think, are very different. If you're talking to somebody in the Black community who maybe they've been facing very violent trauma for a very long time, and then to ask them to be calm in a highly traumatized space, I'm just going to relate this to something unrelated but highly relatable. If you maybe have a parent or like a toxic ex-boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, and every time they get around you, you just lose your shit and you can't stay calm no matter how much you try, hold that feeling, relate to that feeling, and now try to expand it to decades of murder and just centuries, right, of murder, violent murder. Sorry, did you want to say something, Shane? Oh, okay, I just saw your finger go up. But yeah, just really recognizing how triggers and trauma might come up in these conversations. Because generally, opening the door to unpacking extremely violent trauma is no small thing. And you have to really be able to hold that with compassion and care, mention psychological safety. But yeah, so how much time do I have, Melissa? Okay, So the second thing I want to go into, so that was one, that was just knowing yourself. And knowing yourself, right? Those are all three really big things that people might go to decades of therapy just to figure out. And we're asking you to do that in like before a conversation, right? But I think this is a part of the work. Two, I want to go very briefly into nonviolent communication. One, I'm just going to recommend a book. I talk about it all the time. The last I checked, it was $2.99 on Kindle. It's called Difficult Conversations, How to Talk About What Matters Most by Douglas Stone. Breaks it down to really, really tangible, actionable items that helped me in my personal relationships, and I think really applies to having difficult conversations about big things. But I'm just going to recommend that. I'm not going to go into that. One thing I'll say is you use I statements instead of you statements. You statements cause people to feel very judged, and they'll shut down automatically. So instead of just being like, you're being racist and you're not listening to me, there's ways to say that. It's just be like, listen, I feel very unheard right now. You know, I'm noticing that every time I try to talk, you interrupt me. Just really bring it down to objective things and try to remove judgment and use statements from your conversations. It's very hard, but try. The second thing is using descriptive statements instead of judgment statements. So sometimes saying like, listen, you know, sometimes you come off as really racist, or sometimes you come off as really rude, right? Those are judgments and evaluations that you're making and interpreting based on what they're saying. So you might want to just use descriptive statements like, you know, like I mentioned before, you know, I noticed that every time I try to say something that makes you uncomfortable, you might jump in with an interruption. That's a description. I'm just observing something. It's very objective. You can translate that how you want, but I'm just letting you know that this is what's happening, right? And a lot of the times when we talk about emotions, we unintentionally use judgment statements, right? You're making me feel like crap. You know, you're being so rude right now. You're making me feel so angry. You're not listening to me, right? Those are all judgmental statements. So you might want to say like, I just need to take a break because I'm feeling very, I'm feeling myself running out of breath while talking to you in this moment. And I don't really know how to navigate that. Or I'm finding myself getting really angry and frustrated because X, right? So you want to kind of center it on your emotions and try to reduce defensiveness in them to keep the conversation productive. And, you know, again, instead of trying to get them to agree that they're wrong, encouraging curiosity in their perspective, and encouraging curiosity in their perspective and encouraging curiosity in them for your perspective. Does that make sense? And the last thing the number 3 point that I wanted to touch upon, let me know if I'm running out of time, Melissa, is helping people relate. And this I found has been very, very powerful in talking to especially my elder Asians about this topic. Specifically in talking about Black Lives Matter and the oppression, and maybe, actually, let me even narrow it down. Specifically in trying to talk about the protests, I found it quite effective to bring it back to relatable things. Here's what I realized, and I think this is very interesting for Asians that were born in America and may not be fully aware of the history that we come from. Almost every one of our home countries has something traumatic, historically traumatic, in our cultural history, whether that is a cultural revolution or a violent uprising or oppression. And the thing is that this might also bring up triggers in them, right? So for instance, I was having a conversation with an older Korean person around, she was talking with a Black friend of hers, and she does a lot of work in the Asian community around social justice. But then when she was talking to her Black friend, she was like, I feel like this is kind of overreacting. She didn't use the word overreacting, but she related it, for instance, to an acts of racism that were much smaller. And I mentioned how, you know, like she mentioned Vincent Chin, and I get it and I understand. But the difference between these protests and what's been happening to our community around COVID and a lot of these other things is that these are acts of violence from police, right? From law enforcement. And the only thing that I was able to find to relate to was when Japan occupied Korea, and which was like military state, right? And Koreans were getting murdered in the street for either like looking somebody in the eye or, you know, saying something wrong. They were getting raped and murdered. And it's such a big power that sometimes being peaceful doesn't work. And, you know, the question is, would Koreans have been justified in violently uprising against Japanese occupation in that context, right? And you know, every culture has it. Recently, we had the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, right? And if you try to talk to somebody who was around during Tiananmen, am I pronouncing that right? Tiananmen Square, who might have been around during that time, it's the question of, you know, do you feel that the students were justified in their protest? How did the media cover the students protesting during that time? And when you think about the trauma of all of the murders that happened during the protests and how it was so deep and so pervasive across generations, can that be put into the context of the matter right now, the movement right now? There's something similar going on now in the Philippines with the junk terror laws. Like, people are outraged, but if you really think about the use of militia and the senseless murdering of people for dissenting, there's an opportunity there to relate to that trauma and compare that and align that with the trauma that the Black community is going through right now. And that's kind of the work that I've been trying, and it has been working a little bit. Every history has something, right? So I think the thing is if you say, okay, was this community justified? And they say yes. And then you try to ask, okay, but do you believe that the Black community is justified? And they say no, then that's like an actual admittance of believing that the Black community doesn't have the same level of humanity as someone of that race. But that is an actual anti-Blackness conversation where you might not actually be there yet. They might not just actually realize the magnitude of what the community is going through. So that's kind of been a conversation point that has worked for me. Let me see. I think I'm kind of running through, but yeah, I don't know. And I think one other thing I want to mention is just holding compassion for the triggers that they might be experiencing. So for instance, if you're talking to a Korean parent that might have been present during the LA riots, I would actually say that these traumas are a really opportune time to bring in history. So if they were around during the LA riots, then it might be an opportune time to bring in a little bit of history between the Black and the Korean community and how white supremacy and police brutality added to that pressure cooker, right? PBS recently had an amazing series called Asian Americans that's still available for streaming that touches, yes, Yuko, that touches upon that relationship, right? Or if they were, let's say they were refugees and they removed themselves from a situation where violence was constant, then why would they want to align with, like, just mentally, why would they want to align with the force that is currently living that violence, right? Why would they not want to align with the safety and the belonging of America that they came here for? There's certain personal triggers, I think, that are always in play when you're talking to folks from the Asian diaspora. So with that said, I'll just, in the 10 minutes that I had, those are kind of the tips. 1, know yourself deeply. 2, use the tenets of nonviolent communication. And 3, look for opportunities to relate whenever you can, using history and using compassion and using curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess, for dropping so much knowledge on us. As I mentioned, if anyone is interested in learning more about Jess's work, this is kind of her jam, as well as many of our great panelists. I'm going to share a link in the chat box. And so a part of the event that you may have that you signed up for was you submitted amazing questions. I've gathered them. I've tried to pick out the common themes. So to give Jess a minute break, because she was just spewing out like 15 years of knowledge and hard research, we're gonna focus on the other panel and get into a lot of the things you wanted to talk about. So feel free to add in other questions in the chat. Again, we have a lot of great questions that were submitted. I tried to condense them and try to focus them as much as I can. Thank you so much for everyone that's sharing resources. I'm going to jump into the question. And the first one is, what are the actionable things we can do to make the most impact right now? This can relate to being an ally, Asians for Black Lives, and creating sustainable changes in your life. Panelists, you don't have to answer all of those different parts that I mentioned, but feel free to answer it the best you can. Again, the question is, what are actionable things that we can do to make the most impact right now? And you don't have to be so polite. Like, you can fight for it. It's okay.
I can start. Oh.
Got it.
With my organization that I've started with, The World is Watching, we actually do have a petition that currently has 3,500 signatures, and I'll actually drop it in to the chat. And then we've actually it's been proposed by Campaign Zero, and we already have several endorsements. But other things that you can do, obviously the important thing is make sure you vote depending on your state, and to actually pay attention to kind of like what the issues are in your area. And then when it comes to the cases, make sure you reach out to your DA, to the police chiefs, and just really voice your opinion to what you think is actually right in regards to these cases.
We have something in common. We have a lot in common. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And I think right to that point too, to Venery's point about finding your voice and making your voice heard. A lot of the work that I've done around anti-Blackness focused on this concept of a resistance roundabout. So if you're not familiar with a roundabout, you're driving in a road and you can either like go all the way around, you can veer out at any certain point, right? And so that roundabout really has 3 points, and it's reflection, speaking up and inquiring, and then finally identifying points of solidarity. And so a lot of what we've been highlighting and really drilling down is the importance of reflection. Right? Where are you in all of this? And then once you figure out where you're at, you speak up and you start inquiring about, how can I do more, right? So for a lot of folks, it seems that y'all are already in part 2 of the roundabout. In that other aspect of identifying points of solidarity, you really want to figure out where you're positioned. Historically, Asian folks have found their way into what is called racial triangulation. That's where at some point in the white-black binary, Asian folks as a community in this country fall right in the middle. And then within there, you have different gradients based off of like colorism, class, and every other intersecting piece. And so by using this resistance roundabout, you're really able to figure out, okay, I know where I'm at right now in this point in time. Maybe I'm a business owner. Maybe I'm really tight with the local politicians in my area. Maybe I'm an educator. Maybe I'm XYZ person. From there, you can just use your position to speak up about things. If you're a board member, leverage your board. If you're someone who has a matriarch or patriarch role in a family, leverage that influence as well. And then finally, break out of your comfort zone and really figure out, okay, I made one small step towards change. Maybe I noted that I had an implicit bias just now. I saw someone that appeared Black, I locked my door. Right? Or I did something that could easily be considered anti-Black and I resisted that action and I moved forward, right? Pat yourself on the back and continue to resist that. So I think using a roundabout that's focused on reflection, speaking up, and then identifying where you can really build out true solidarity and then holding that with resisting implicit bias are really key actionable steps.
So a lot of my work focuses on mindfulness and using our ability to watch our thoughts and be detached from those thoughts. So you learn to see the stories in your mind play out. And the stories come out of a part of the brain called the default mode network. And through social conditioning, just by living in America and even many parts of the world, you absorb colorism and you absorb that white is good. And in general, we look at power structures and we have this instinctive tendency to want to move up in status, right? And to gain power because there's safety and security. And we also don't like to, be socially isolated or ostracized. And so I think within the Asian community, there's some cultural conditioning around not speaking out, not wanting to offend anybody, being perfectionist and not doing something until you're absolutely an expert on something, right? Not wanting to make a mistake, not wanting to be wrong, and then not willing to explore how you benefit from the power structure and whether or not you're willing to sacrifice that benefit for the greater good. So when I think about what I've been doing, and not every, there's no size fits all for what you should do, because I think it depends on your situation, your age, your social networks, how much resources, what organizations you're a part of. but I've started to push the organizations that I'm part of to look at how they support unconscious bias or institutionalized racism. Who's not at the table? Who's not in the room? So I've started to tell people organizing panels that I don't want to be the only person of color on a panel. So if you want me on the panel, we've got to invite more POC. We have to make this more racially inclusive. And if you need help inviting or researching other speakers, I can help use my networks to add more people and amplify other voices. The second thing is I've been encouraging the organizations I'm part of to put out statements to support the end of racial injustice, to support inclusion, to support economic inclusion, because a lot racism, as you can see by the definition I shared in the beginning, it's all about power. That power is not shared equally. That power is held at the top by mostly white people. And to be anti-racist is to be aware of the power structure and to help dismantle that power structure in every little way that you can add to that. It's like water beating down on a rock, right? It's not going to happen right away, but over time the rock does break, right? And so I look at economic racism. To what degree are people not buying goods from Black entrepreneurs, not investing in Black companies, not renting affordable housing to Black people? Like, you have to think through, like, what is your participation in the economy as a consumer? And are you consuming anti-Blackness in that way? Are you consuming status symbols that are racially exclusive? Like, and there you see now this whole trend of canceling, right? When brands and companies say things that are racist, that there is power in everyone boycotting them. So I would say, think about where you shop, where you consume, how you use your money. Are you frequenting businesses that contribute to anti-racism, right? And I think that's one of the most important things to realize, is that wealth in America is so unevenly distributed. The average Black family has 1/10 the wealth of the average white family, right? And even a college-educated Black person, you know, often makes the same as a high school dropout white person, right? That's really, really bizarre, right? And as Asian Americans, we're so focused on the American dream, like sometimes we don't realize who's being left behind as we climb over them. And I think if with the Collective Success Network, one of our core behaviors that we want the students to learn is to pay it forward, to lift as you climb. Don't just be self-centered about your own journey, but look at the wider picture. Look at your friends. Like, is anyone stumbling? Does anyone not have access to resources or knowledge or social networks? Because a lot of what we've realized is that the social mobility factor comes from your social networks. About 90% of white people only hang out with other white people. So their whole social networks are white, right? My social networks are blended. And I think the more you diversify your social networks and you see everyone as a human being and not as a race, the more you invest in people who could use your help to move up in economic mobility, you're going to end up dismantling white supremacy, because white supremacy was always about crippling Black communities, like lynching whole towns, massacring whole towns where Black people had accumulated wealth and power, right? And so the more you help Black people accumulate wealth and power, right, like, you're gonna start to untangle this very messy history of our country. So I think those are things to be mindful of, is your consumption patterns, and then the organizations you're part of. How can you promote racial inclusion? If you're part of a group that's 90% white or Asian, push them to recruit and engage more Black people to join the organization. If you are, you know, frequenting certain restaurants, change the restaurants, go to Black-owned restaurants. Does that make sense?
You're good. Thank you for that. Would anyone else? Jess?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And I think on a ground level, because I think we have people of different levels of power here, right? Like some of us are able to encourage people to come into the board, and some of us have that buying power, where some of us are trying to, do things on kind of like a more ground level basis. And I want to address one thing, and I also want to address a question that was asked in the chat, which is like, how do we talk to our friends about like not, just deleting everybody that doesn't align with them, which kind of touched upon something that Zoe said. So one thing that I want to talk about with that is, with this whole like canceling culture and just cutting people out, I think it's really interesting because the Asian community talks so much about how like being a tiger mom has like messed them up mentally and like given them anxiety and like really stressed them out for like a lifetime to come. But in some ways we're kind of doing the same thing with our friends and our the way that we're handling social justice activism, which is like, if you're not perfect, there's no room for growth, right? If you're not perfect, there's no real room for you to not be perfect. So you're either getting 100, this 75 is not good enough for me, you're out, right? So I just want to kind of like encourage an open-mindedness when it comes to that and encourage compassion. There's a few folks here who, there's like a lot of conflicting information happening. And I think a tangible action item could be, people keep saying just educate yourself, right? Like people can't do that education work for you, but there's people out here like Zoe who have like a wealth of knowledge, who Vannery and Shane, they all have so much knowledge, but they might not have the emotional capacity to actually sit down and teach you. Somebody kind of has to start that conversation for us. So if you find yourself in a position where you want to learn, maybe you can have like a Zoom viewing party with your friends, or like a Netflix party with your friends about, 13th, or there's a lot of, what's that movie that they just put out, Just Mercy? There's a few movies that are being released for free that for the sake of education, that people can do in groups, right? And then you can kind of debrief around it later. I know that it's kind of weird to do that with people who maybe think like you, but it's you have to start somewhere, and the space, you want to create these vulnerable spaces where you're not creating some echo chamber to make yourself feel better, right? You want to create an uncomfortable safe space so that we can have these conversations. And if people have questions, then maybe asking those questions to people outside of your circle to try to see where it can go. But chances are you have somebody who's been in the social activism world higher up on the rung as you, that may not necessarily be Black, but they might have been aligned in some way. So I want to just kind of say, start there. Or if you want to attend a protest, but you don't, right? Like I'm not a protest person, right? I get very anxious around crowds. I'm still very nervous around COVID, but I want to be supportive. So what about creating protest packages where it's like, you got hand sanitizer, water bottles, things like that. You donate to people at sites. There's a lot of other ways that people can be involved, but a lot of people are saying, and this is really where it starts with us, which is to figure out frameworks and methods of self-reflection, do them in community, right? I think overall as Asians, we're a very collectivist society. Zoe mentioned earlier this fear of isolation, this fear of being ostracized, and that's a very real fear, ancestral fear in us, because we're a collectivist society that relies on each other for survival, right, historically. So we're afraid of speaking out. So creating safe spaces where we can do this in community with each other. Okay. So I think that's another thing. And then to just journal about it, man. Sometimes like other people haven't earned the right to see your deepest shame and your deepest vulnerability. And it's really hard to do that in a non-judgmental space. I really encourage you to journal about your ugliest, right, selves, and find compassion in there so that you can move out of it and start moving towards a space of love. I don't think furthering the guilt, furthering the shame is not going to create a more loving environment. And I think we all know at this point, there's no justice without love, you guys. We have to figure out a way to create loving spaces within ourselves and each other here.
Amazing. Is it safe for me to jump to the next question?
Well, I wanted to add one point about like, it's learning how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Like this whole conversation, it's like being willing to be a little bit less safe, right? Because I think we talk about safe, but actually it'll never be completely safe to have this type of conversation. And I also want to put out there that not everyone is ready to be an anti-racist, right? And you can't impose your timeline on someone else. my parents are not ready to be anti-racist right now, right? No matter what I say, what I do, that's not a message that they're looking for and they want to hear, right? So I think the awakening process that people go through to become woke, right? It happens on their own timeline, based on their own experiences, based on realizations that they have, you know, in their personal lives, internally, whatever's happening in their head. And you can't make them, force them to accelerate that path towards the timeline you want. And so sometimes you just have to accept people as they are and be uncomfortable with their belief systems, and yet be willing to show them in a compassionate way, like wonderful Black people. And that's the only way sometimes to combat anti-Blackness, is to recognize that humans relate to other human beings once they get to know each other. This is why the social networking is so important. So if it's their stereotypical projection of what a Black person is, you're never going to win. But if I bring Shane, or I bring my Black friends, and I say, like, they stay over at my house, and my family's like, your friend's really cool and really awesome, and you know, like defying the stereotype, and most of my friends are amazing people, right? Then my parents start to go, oh, when I think of this person, I know what you mean. They're not the stereotype. And then you start to break down the misguided ideas that people have, the anti-Black ideas. So I just want to put that out there, that it's going to be okay if you can't change somebody. You can't change everybody, and not everybody wants to change. But when you introduce humanity into the equation, when they start to meet amazing people in your network who are Black, sometimes that's the best way of challenging the way they see the world.
And Shane is pretty cool. He's the only one that showed up in a full tux to the Zoom call. Just saying. Like, I'm wearing like lounge pants.
I have the pants that match the jacket.
All right, so we're gonna jump into the next one, which we kind of talked a little bit about. And Jess, I want to start with you. What are things I should do? I guess the person wrote this. What are the things I should do that should avoid doing that could avoid? I'm gonna start that over. What are things I should avoid that could trigger trauma, cause harm, and/or risk of being canceled?
So I touched upon this a little bit earlier. I think that's going to be really tough, to be honest, because everybody has their own personal trigger or trauma at this point. And I think, you know, I think somebody mentioned that earlier, that there's a fear of being canceled or a fear of doing things wrong that are stopping people from speaking up, right? And I think the reality is that, and this comes up a lot in these kind of panel discussions as well, is that at any given point, you're going to have people at various levels of activism. And people who have been doing this for a while might have recommendations for you that tell you that you're doing things wrong. And there's a lot of insecurity or uncertainty about what, you know, and then you get imposter syndrome, and should I even be saying anything? But the reality is that you have to start somewhere. And I want to bring in a framework. I keep absorbing these frameworks and my mind just like deletes who actually says it, but maybe you guys can Google it and figure out who it's coming from. But it's the 4 C's around building confidence to something. So the first C is to find the courage to just start and find the courage to do it, right? So it doesn't matter how scary it is, you are going to face things, but you have to have the courage to sit in it and just be vulnerable in it. The second C is to commit, right? So you might end up, you know, finding a lot of opposition, but you want to, because you're committed to this anti-Blackness journey, you want to sit there and sit in it and figure out different ways to learn how to be different or how to do things differently from people who might have been doing this from you, etc. So that's courage, commit. With commitment comes competence. You will get better at it the more that you do it. I've been doing this for 15 years and I'm still learning from people, right? And then with competence comes confidence, right? So I think the thing is that you can't just jump straight to confidence from just starting. You really have to learn to, like Dwayne said, to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And when somebody gives you feedback, here's the other thing, the person giving you feedback might not also know how to communicate in the most intentional manner, right? Or they might be coming from a space of trigger, or they might be coming from a space of exhaustion or, you know, fear, shame, whatever. So really learning to ask questions around, okay, well, what did you mean by that when you said this? and what specifically did I do that aligned with your definition, but really learning to ask questions instead of just immediately shutting down into a space of defensiveness and fear. I don't really know if that's where everybody is coming from, but I think that I've seen that as a pattern with people just being scared to start.
Do you mind sharing the 4 C's again in the chat? Because some people are asking. Oh, I'm actually on the same article. Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on how not to get canceled?
Sure. I mean, I think it takes a willingness to slow down what you type, what you write, and what you say, and the mindfulness comes in. Gandhi, I think, and Martin Luther King, others have said, like, you know, be mindful of your thoughts because they become your words. Be mindful of your words, your actions, which be your values, and your values become your destiny, right? And most of us, we have like the monkey mind says something and we type it and put it on social media right away. And that's where you get in trouble, right? So I think if you're willing to slow down, and for instance, when I write articles, like I get 10 people to read them before I publish it. I'm not sure who that is, but if you can mute, that would be helpful. So if you're willing to slow down your communication and not just tweet everything that comes to your mind, it becomes much easier to have a dialogue. And you know, in Jainism, in this religion, there's this practice of not getting attached to your beliefs, not being attached to any belief being right, and just be willing to be to just say all of this is a story. Like, I have a story of this, I have a story of that, because your mind is basically constructing your reality constantly, and the things you believed when you were 5 changed. You don't believe those things anymore. You don't necessarily believe in Santa or the Tooth Fairy anymore, right? And so the things that you believed last year and this year change. If you're willing to just say, like, all of this happening in my mind is noise, and then let me meditate and slow down and then think through and reflect on what are the insights I really want to share, right? What does my inner wisdom tell me, you know, makes sense at this moment to say? What do I feel in my emotions? What are they guiding me to? How are they guiding me to connect to someone else? If you just slow everything down, the risk of getting canceled almost gets eliminated. It's when we act really impulsively, really reactively, really quickly, following whatever the voice in your head tells you. And a lot of times it's like an inner critic. It's just beating yourself up or beating someone else up. And the mindfulness process is about unpacking your inner critic, understanding how much is tied into your social conditioning, the negative experiences you had as a kid that were very punishing, that you want to avoid and never experience again, the traumas that you've lived through, and how you kind of reenact those traumas so that they don't actually happen in a way that you can't control, right? So there's so much about being human that makes no sense in your unconscious mind. And if you just accept that, instead of believing that you're in complete control of your mind, life becomes a lot easier. Then you start to work with that monkey mind, you start to befriend that monkey mind, and you start to realize all the things the monkey mind says, even if it has an anti-Black narrative, anti-Asian narrative, it doesn't mean that you believe those things, right? So if someone had put in their dialogue, like, I know people who have Black friends who still say anti-Black things. And my response was, I know Black people who say anti-Black things, because that conditioning is so deep-rooted and pervasive into your unconscious mind that when the stories come, we verbalize them. When you start to learn how not to verbalize those stories, like, that's a practice of mindfulness, and it takes a lot of time to cultivate. And when you're stressed out and emotions are raw, it's much harder to slow the process down because we all erupt, you know, it becomes like a powder cake situation. And even when that happens, to be like, I understand why I said those things, or I couldn't control and slow down myself from saying those things. I wasn't practicing NVC or nonviolent communication. It's because things are too raw for you to do that, right? These last few weeks, the pandemic, I think it's been a lot harder for people to be emotionally regulated. And so to expect people to be at their best behavior right now would be unrealistic. And I think it's important to give us all more compassion and hold space for each other's healing, because we're all in a way broken and suffering. And even people at the top of the power structure are often broken and traumatized and suffering too. So that's what I wanted to share.
Awesome. Shane, did you want to jump in before I ask the last question?
I think to Zway's point specifically, I know Melissa, we had a conversation prior to the panel about how in my own life, holding on to, you know, self-hate and then holding on to anti-Black bias has been an ongoing struggle. And it's something that, you know, mindfulness has really helped me with. It's a lot about waking, not necessarily waking people up, but like slowly but surely guiding them on their journey around like, hey, look, and I know I put this in the chat earlier, but Angela Davis crystallized this perfectly for me back when I was at Syracuse. She highlighted how individuals get really defensive when you say that they're anti-Black or when you say that they're X-ism or X thing, right? Because it almost looks like an attack on the self. But if you're able to sit there and situate their behavior in a larger oppressive system and help them observe that behavior and kind of be a passenger, it can really win over a lot more people, right? It looks like, hey, to the point around like that friend, those friends who have black friends making anti-Black posts, it could simply say like, hey, look, I saw this post. I recently went to this conversation around anti-Blackness, and I think it has a few pieces of that in there. I know you're not racist. I know you're not anti-Black, but this is what it could feel like to someone else. And I really want to talk through this with you. Could we set up some time and have a conversation about this, right? And really discuss it and talk it through. It's an ongoing conversation. It's always going to be a marathon. And it really just takes like loving yourself enough to be like, you know what, I need to grow out of this. I need to motivate myself to get out of this place because it's not helpful or beneficial to the larger community around me.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that. There was 3 main points that I wanted to call on preventing the cancel culture. So the first point was to make sure that you're receiving quality information, because obviously misinformation is really big right now, especially since when the United Kingdom left the Brexit referendum, when the Brexit referendum got passed in GDPR. That's something that the US had to be really cognizant of, because a lot of countries like Russia are using the racist history that were happening to Blacks to manipulate our elections. And so a lot of anti-Black rhetoric were being spewed into other non-Black communities. So that's definitely one thing to like be cognizant of too. And the second thing is just kind of like watch how you post things, especially on social media. An example I had about this was the European line called Pretty Little Thing. They actually recently posted a drawing of a picture that was dark Black and a picture of a hand holding that was like stark white. And now they're going to be losing businesses because once Black Twitter got a hold of it, they said, we don't agree with this. Not every Black person comes in this shade, you know, just like with all the other, you know, minorities, you know, as far as Black people ages, we come from the lightest complexion to the darkest complexion, especially with genetics. So that's something that you definitely need to be cognizant of, you know, watch how you use humor. And then back to my point about making sure you have quality information, don't rely on social media influencers. Their job is to they're paid to make certain brands look cool. You know, that's why, you know, even like going back to even being back in whether it's elementary school or high school, looking at credible resources, not looking at the first thing that you've seen. It's so easy to manipulate pictures and information right now. So that will prevent your business from losing a lot of money and endorsements.
Amazing. So I think last question we have here is, how do I know what I'm doing is enough with the amount of time, energy, and resources I have? I think that right now, we're bombarded. I won't say bombarded. I apologize for that. I would say we're surrounded by this topic 24/7. And I know for me, I will recognize that in many ways, I've been heavily immersed in this for 3 weeks, but that is also a reflection of my privilege. recognizing that I'm not Black and I'm not as well versed in the Black experience. So I understand that for me, it's only been 3 weeks. For a lot of people, it's their whole lifetime. It's their whole family's lifetime, and centuries before that. That being said, for someone that is new to this and hasn't been experiencing this, it can be very overwhelming. And like Jess said, it's like swallowing the sun. So how do we know when what we're doing, this person asked, is doing is enough? And how can we like take care of ourselves during this time to go back out there and fight again? Because this is just a start of the movement. Like, this isn't going to just end when the protesting stops.
So there's something I want to say that's about language, right? So we often use the word fight, combat, battle. And with racism, the truth is it's about healing. The more you fight, the more you create conflict, the more you antagonize, right? Then it pushes back. Like, it's physics. You push into something, there's a force that bounces you back. But when you seek to heal and you transform, there is it's expansion, right? You're not as tired, right? And there's an energy that comes from healing that makes you feel whole. And I think when we focus on, I mean, the anti-racism word sounds like it's anti this, anti that. It has the idea of a battle. But if you think of anti-racism more as healing racism, right? I think it then creates a totally different framework for you. And if you think about healing, you know, dissociation and dehumanization, because that's what racism is. It was constructed as a way for some people to say, we are human, those people are not human, so we can mistreat them, right? But the only way a human being can mistreat another human being is by dissociating. You have to turn off your own compassion and your own empathy to treat someone else like an animal, right? Like, even people treat dogs better than they've treated some human beings. And so if we think about it more as, to what degree am I whole now, right? Can I stop dissociating by putting other people down, by dehumanizing other people? Can I end that process in myself, right? And help other people end that process too. We become whole, we become integrated as people. The heart, mind, head, soul, spirit, it all comes together in alignment, right? You start to live your values. That's the tragic thing about racism, is it pits groups against each other. And if you contribute to the power dynamics that are set up so that Asians fight Blacks, fight Latinos, fight Indigenous people for attention and spotlight and focus, then we're not healing that rift. And I think it's more about reaching out and saying, I see your humanity, right? And even if you can go to a Trump supporter and say, I see your humanity, right? They may start to like realize they should see your humanity back. That doesn't always happen, but a lot of times it gets reciprocated. And I think there are Black people who have been reaching out to KKK members and helping to humanize that interaction, and people have left the KKK as a result of seeing Black people as human beings. So I think it's very important for you to recognize that adding to the fight may just make everything escalate more, because offense creates defense, blah, blah, blah. But if you're able to heal and bring people into wholeness, then, you know, people realize like, oh, there's no reason to think of a Black person as non-human, right? It's no reason for me to think of an Asian person as non-human, because it hurts me. I lose my own humanity when I do that. So I hope that helps.
I have two quotes, one from Asian activist Grace Lee Boggs, and then one from, you know, an amazing Black queer author, James Baldwin. So from Grace Lee Boggs, you cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it, right? So any sort of action that you take that says, ooh, you know what, I changed my approach a little bit. I just did a little thing, right? Collect that small win. And that's a reminder to really pour back into yourself. Because as someone who navigates the world as a Black and Indian man, you know, there's this element, right, of taking responsibility for advancing communication and advancing conversations and advancing education around this. Because I'm trying to create, one, selfishly, I'm trying to create safety for myself. There's a lot of people that don't view me as human. The Central Park incident, showed me that at least in New York City, my life is less than a dog. So it's a lot, it's protective for me first. But another element from James Baldwin, right? Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So if you're thinking about doing nothing, you're taking an action to do nothing. But if you're thinking about doing something, you're actually like finding ways to change it in your own special way. I think another element too from James Baldwin is this aspect of when we look at white supremacy, we really have to remember that we're trying to deconstruct something that white folks may solely root their identity in. So if you root your identity solely in just a superiority complex, you're missing out on a lot. You're missing out on a presence. You're missing out on so much more of the world. And if we kind of bring it back into our conversation and in our dialogue, the small changes that you create over time, they're just going to compound, right? So I don't know if everybody's been seeing the stock market dip or whatever today, but that's a great example, right? To relate it back to family members. So if you have that family member that was like, you have to go do finance, you have to go do finance, you have to go do finance. I had an uncle that told me that. I went to college for psych and education. It didn't work. But those changes compound over time, right? So what investment can you make in the larger index fund for equity and impact, right? What investment can you make in yourself to become an active anti-racist? And I think if we start utilizing different structures and different examples that make it relatable, it feels a little bit better too, because we got to find a way to go from theory to practice.
Vanner?
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that the panelists said. I feel like the main thing to realize if you're doing everything you can is if you never had an experience with having an uncomfortable situation. I'll just say this from my personal perspective. There was times personally for me being Cambodian and Black that I was never really accepted by the Asian community. And so having those types of advocates and those types of sponsors in these types of environments, challenging the status quo of what it means to be an Asian American and what it means to be supported and what it means to just, have different characteristics that aren't a part of the norm that was established by colonial thoughts. I think that's something that I personally feel like is the most important. And even just creating those like social entrepreneurship projects saying like, hey, we haven't really worked with this community before. What can we do to increase relations? What can we do to foster innovation? If you have someone that's struggling with math and someone that's good at English and someone that's bad at English and good at math, you can also come together and create change in those types of aspects.
And I'll jump in. As far as the wording of the question, which is how do you know when you've done enough? I think that word enough is a very fuzzy word. I think when it comes to something as systemic and just global as anti-Blackness, it's a moving goalpost that depending on where the person telling you you're enough, you'll never be enough. So I think, I want you to kind of let go of that word enough and just see how you can always be an active participant. I think what's really interesting about suddenly knocking everything that you've known to be true and seeing the world for what it is, which is happening right now, is I'm kind of comparing it to like learning a new language in a way, or like, you're like being born, you're born, you just hatched, right? Welcome. This world fucking sucks, right? Sorry for but like you're just hatched into this like kind of very violent world, and you have to figure out how to find safety in it while also creating safe spaces for other people. So with that word, with enough, like, are you ever going to be enough? And if anybody's ever been in like a really violent relationship, you're never enough, right? So there's a few things that I kind of want in the same way as far as like learning a language. I want you to or I want to encourage creating just smaller goalposts for yourself, right? You're not going to be able, maybe you won't be able to have this high level conversation in this new language, but maybe you can learn how to say one word differently. Maybe you can learn how to unlearn things first, right? A lot of the times if you know English and you want to learn like an Asian language where the syntax is completely different, you're going to actually have to unlearn, you have to attach yourself to the Western syntax in order to accept the Eastern syntax, right? So there's a lot of unlearning that you have to do. I think it depends on what stage you're in, but you want to share goalposts. You want to set goalposts for yourself, right? And then the other thing is just acknowledging that one, this is a new world. This isn't something you can just do good at, get an A in, and that's it. You're done. You graduated, right? You're officially living in this whole new world. So what does that mean for you? Yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with that, but I just wanted to say that. Is it ever going to be enough? Every day is enough as long as you're doing the work. So
I think your A comment was so great, bringing back the tiger mom that you mentioned earlier, because all of us wants to strive for that A, right? Like being Asian in the Asian American Pacific Islander community, but it's not about that. It's not just one exam. This is life, and the things that we're talking about is, again, just an introduction. We're here to help spark conversation and invite you to go deeper, because this is an issue of systemic dehumanization of Black people in this country and around the world. So thank you so much. If everyone can take a moment to unmute yourself and give this wonderful panel a round of applause, if you're open to that. Thank you so
amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm gonna do this from now on to unmute everyone and let them say thank you.
Yeah, that's a really nice feeling. I think I usually have to just sit here in silence, like nodding at people until they leave. So this is really nice.
And so, as I promised, please remember to download the chat. I can't send it out, probably for legal purposes, because we have people's information on here. But if you choose to download it by clicking the button to download the chat.
All right.
Done? Okay, I'm muting everyone again.
Oh, these people are not on a panel. These are. Oh, it's just open.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna unmute the panel now that I can get back control. I can't. Oh no, I can't find Vannery.
I'm here.
Okay, I was like, I can't unmute. Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining. We just hit a little bit over time. We just want to say thank you for taking the time to be uncomfortable with us. Hopefully this knowledge was helpful to you. Please remember to take care of yourself during this time. Take a break. Take time to care for your mental health. Be kind and be gentle with yourself. We're all learning and striving to be our best self. So I want to personally thank you for striving with me. I'll see you at the next event and follow up with more resources. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for holding space. Bye.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.